Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do.
At the heat of the Second World War, millions of women found themselves locked away in concentration camps, waiting for their execution. But in Nazi-occupied Europe, death wasn't the most terrifying punishment. Within these walls, women became commodities, traded for pleasure by both soldiers and inmates, whether they liked it or not. For decades, their stories have long been forgotten, as Germany tries to wipe away this dark era. Join us as we peel back the pages of time, unveiling untold stories of Nazi abuse of women in concentration camps. The Paris brothels. In the early hours of June 14, 1940, the people of Paris woke up to the sounds they thought they'd never hear. As dozens of loudspeakers echoed throughout the city, the once bustling metropolis now shuddered under the intimidating sounds of the German soldiers. France was never prepared for this. After all, they managed to defeat Germany during the First World War. For a city that wasn't prepared for an invasion, this was bad news, especially for the vulnerable population, which mostly included women and children. But as the German soldiers marched into the French capital, they were immediately blown away, not just by the beauty of the city, but the women who littered the streets. French women have always been famous for their charm, and the Nazis wanted them for themselves. Seeing this as an opportunity to boost the morale of the fighting soldiers, the high-ranking Nazi officials decided to give them a free pass. This was where the Nazi brothels came in. You see, unlike other occupied cities where the women were brutally taken advantage of anywhere the Nazis wanted, slavery in Paris was organized. But before the German soldiers ever stepped foot on French soil, France already had a long history of sex work. It's a story that goes back to the Middle Ages, when French adult workers were generally accepted in society and were even housed in convent-like houses. As a matter of fact, sex work was so normalized that King Philip II made a rule stating that brothels should be located less than 300 meters from a church, so the clients could easily repent after their visit. By the time Paris fell under Nazi occupation, the city had enough brothels to keep the German soldiers occupied for a while. At first, only the low-ranking soldiers frequented these so-called closed houses. But it didn't take long for the leading figures of the Third Reich to join in. A good example is Hermann Göring, who was a regular guest at several luxurious brothels, where he and several other German officers were entertained by young and beautiful French women. Many of the high-class brothels were controlled by wealthy madams, who were rewarded with large fees, expensive gifts, and a couple of invaluable art pieces stolen from Eastern Europe. Speaking about the Nazi brothels in Paris, author Patrick Buisson described it as the worst example of actual collaboration that helped sustain the Nazi occupiers. He called it a golden age for French brothels. Many of them were almost shut down before the war began, but now that the Nazis had taken over, they were free to do business. A good example of this was Le Chabanais. On the outside, Le Chabanais looks like a regular old house, but during the dark days of the Nazi occupation, it was one of the most bustling locations in all of France. The history of this brothel dates back to the year 1878, when Madame Kelly officially opened her doors to pleasure seekers across the city. It only took a few years for the brothel to become known far and wide around Europe, becoming one of the most profitable brothels of its time. In its glory days, Le Chabanais was a popular tourist destination, more like the Notre Dame Cathedral or the Eiffel Tower. So when the Nazis came into the city, they felt right at home within its walls. This wasn't any ordinary brothel, though. We're talking themed rooms, like the Louis XVI, which featured a monarchic decoration. Then there was the Moorish room, which was frequented by the famous poet Guy de Maupassant. Every single room was built to cater for the sexual fantasies of the Nazi officers, from the tame sections to those built to serve the wildest fetishes. Situated right next to the Louvre Museum, Le Chabanais was a place of constant orgies, with an abundance of drugs, sex, and alcohol. This wasn't the only spot, though. According to Buisson's book, the German military established and controlled at least 22 brothels across France just for their own use. And while the number of adult workers in France was pretty high before the war, it quickly multiplied sixfold. At some point, at least 10,000 French women were subjected. Some did it willingly, since that was the quickest way to make money at the time, while others were kidnapped and forced. There was Le Sphinx, also one of the most luxurious brothels in France. During the German occupation, the facility was taken over by the Nazi officers to keep themselves from mingling with the general population. Eva Braun, Hitler's partner, was said to have visited the brothel alongside her friends, and even Hitler himself supposedly ate at the restaurant back in June 1940. Then there was the 122, another infamous brothel occupied by the Germans. Located on 122 Rue de Provence, 8th arrondissement of Paris, the facility was considered a place of after-work relaxation for many German officers. Other honorable mentions include La Rue des Moulins and Chez Marguerite, all of which were reserved for the high-ranking German officers. After World War II was over, the brothels were closed by law in 1946. But while the experience in France was pretty tame, the same cannot be said about Poland. It was almost dawn on September 1st, 1939, when the noise started. The sounds of German planes and artillery filled the air, catching an unprepared Poland at the worst time possible. Hitler had been nursing this dream in his heart since the First World War ended. The mission? Capture the once German port of Danzig and the Polish corridor. With Stalin's signature on the Nazi-Soviet pact, Hitler was sure that no one could stop him from taking Poland by force. As the first set of artillery shells were launched,
some bearing artillery and rocket guns already opening fire.
The Luftwaffe began destroying the Polish Air Force on the ground. Within a matter of days, Poland had become a wasteland, now under the control of the SS, Heinrich Himmler's special unit. But it wasn't just the Polish lands or resources that fell into the Nazis' greedy hands. The women also suffered immensely at the hands of the Germans. Unlike the situation in France, though, the brothels in Poland were cruel and filled with forced sex work. Although the Nazis preached a message of modernity and civilization, the senior German officials allowed the soldiers to do whatever they wanted. But after watching the situation unfold for a while, they decided to step up and put up a structure. Several buildings were then set apart to house these sex workers, most of whom were forced to take part whether they wanted to or not. For the soldiers, though, spending time in these pleasure houses wasn't free. Soldiers were charged per hour, which meant that one woman could be taken advantage of by multiple men every single day. Of all those unlucky enough to find themselves in these situations, only very few made it out alive. Those who didn't die from exhaustion were later killed by the sadistic soldiers. For them, sex wasn't just about pleasure, but a means of exerting control and desecrating the lands of their enemies. But if you thought the situation in Poland was bad, you should see what happened inside the camps. If you thought the use of women as spoils of war was limited to the occupied territories, you'd be very, very wrong. Inside the death camps, where captured war prisoners were getting slaughtered in thousands, the Germans established brothels to serve the pleasure of the soldiers stationed there. As of 1942, Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's trusted general, ordered the establishment of brothels within the concentration camps in all Nazi-occupied territories. The initial idea was to increase the productivity of the prisoners within the camp. Apparently, the Germans created a system where hard-working prisoners were allowed a visit to the brothel once every week. The first brothel, established in 1942, was situated behind the barred windows at Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. However, more soon followed in other camps like Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Dachau and Flossenburg, among others. Two of the largest concentration camps were located in Auschwitz. Inside this death camp, there was the main brothel nicknamed Puff, situated behind the sinister Arbeit macht frei entrance in Block 24. The facility was established at the beginning of the Second World War after Hitler took control of Poland. By the time the war was over, Auschwitz had become the largest kill zone in history, where women were treated as objects rather than humans. In Auschwitz alone, about 1.3 million people were butchered. Some were brutally executed, some were beaten to death, a few 100,000 dropped dead under slave labor, while an unknown number lost their lives within the gas chambers. But while all the killing was going on, the Nazis were busy designing pleasure spots for both the prisoners and Nazi soldiers. Siegfried Schweler, an SS doctor, was commissioned for the implementation of these plans. In an in-house meeting with prison doctors, he spelled out the rules that would govern the brothels. Schweler instructed staff to ensure both the male and female prisoners were clean, that the women were sterilized, and that only the missionary sex position was allowed. The worst part, however, was that the camp leader instructed that the camp thugs were allowed to watch through the spy hole while the intercourse was going on. This was to ensure that the women didn't spend more than 15 minutes with each prisoner. In addition, Schwela also imposed strict race laws, stating that only German men could visit German women and Slavic men could only meet with Slavic women. However, Jews and Russian prisoners were forbidden. Non-Jewish women were deceived into volunteering, with the promise of better living conditions and better food rations. Women in their early 20s were forced to have sex with an average of 6 to 8 men between 8 to 10 p.m. every single day, even on Sundays. Then there were the so-called special brothels, where as many as 21 women prisoners worked. The final Nazi brothel was opened in 1945, the year the Second World War ended. With the liberation of Poland, prisoners who previously worked in the brothels were given a humiliating medical check and had their genitals disinfected openly. However, the women who volunteered to work as prostitutes in the camp were not treated as promised. Although considered a means of survival and escaping hard labor, that turned out to be the only benefits they enjoyed. Because of this, even after the war was over, many of these women had no choice but to continue the trade that helped them survive the war. However, Auschwitz wasn't the only camp filled with brothels. While the brothels at Auschwitz were filled with women from inside the camp, other brothels were supplied by the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where only women were housed. These camp brothels were built as barracks, surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Inside, there were small individual rooms where up to 20 female prisoners were locked up, under the control of a female overseer known as Aufseherin. Because of the demand on their bodies, the women had to be replaced frequently, as they would suffer from exhaustion and illness. Many of them ended up dying within these brothels. Those who survived were transferred to the kill zones, where they were later executed. According to the rules, camp brothels were only open in the evenings. Any inmate who had access to the customer lineup had to sign up for a specific day in advance and pay 2 Reichsmarks for a 20-minute service. Just like it was across Nazi-occupied Europe, most of these women were considered less than humans. There's even a story about some of the women getting tattoos on their chests saying "Feld Hür." To keep them from getting pregnant, some of these women underwent forced sterilization. Those who accidentally got pregnant were forced to get an abortion, which often resulted in their deaths. In total, over 34,000 women were subjected to this treatment across Europe under the Nazis. Those unlucky enough to witness these dark days tell horrible stories. They claim that while the brothel may seem like a gift, it was actually designed to humiliate people. A prisoner named Mieczysław Zayak revealed that on the day the brothel was opened, everybody was forced to gather on the roll call square. Each prisoner was then given a coupon with the whole camp watching. But while most of the prisoners would have preferred a better meal portion, or maybe even their freedom, they were rewarded with sex. Another survivor named Zofia Bator-Stepien mentioned how one girl had to work in the brothel out of desperation for a slice of bread. As the story goes, the Nazis put out an announcement that they were looking for volunteers for very light labor. With little to no employment available, this unnamed victim signed up, alongside other young women. Unfortunately though, the job description wasn't exactly crystal clear. After the doctor was done checking the girl, he then asked her if she had any idea where she was going. The girl then responded, stating that all she was told was that it would be easy and that she would get a lot of bread. This perfectly describes the state of mind of many of those forced to work in these brothels. While a few of them knew what they were getting into, others were tricked with promises of a better life, or sometimes just a slice of bread. There was also a difference between the women working at the brothels and female prisoners. According to a former prisoner named Zofia Bator-Stepien, some of the brothel workers actually loved working there. As a matter of fact, many of them would walk around seductively, wearing makeup and dressed in fine clothing, while locked in one of the most horrifying death camps in Europe. There was even a case of a woman who got fired from the brothel and kept begging so they could take her back. However, by the time the war was over, a lot of these women had lost their excitement. For the most part, these women kept their experiences to themselves and never talked about it until their death. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. It's been many decades since Nazi Germany threw the world into chaos, and very little evidence of Nazi abuse of women in concentration camps remains. However, pictures like these remind us of how horrible the experience was. While most historians only talk about the grown women who got caught in this bad situation, most people forget that even children were not exempted. In several concentration camps across Europe, many female teenagers were either forced or tricked into becoming sex workers. Their innocence was taken without remorse, and because their reproductive organs were tampered with, many of them were never able to have children. Why did the Nazis prey on the children in occupied territories, and why are historians trying to sweep this under the carpet? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. Now let's get back to the video. Heinrich Luitpold Himmler, the man behind the madness. While he was alive, Hitler trusted only a few men. Heinrich Luitpold Himmler was one of them. During the golden days of the Third Reich, Himmler was a leading member of the Nazi Party and one of the most notable and powerful men to ever serve under Hitler. However, he's mostly remembered as one of the active pioneers of the Holocaust. Himmler's rise to military power was also quite dramatic, just like Hitler's. After serving in a reserve battalion during the First World War without ever seeing combat, Himmler went on to join the Nazi Party in 1923. Later in 1925, he joined the SS, a small paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party that served as a bodyguard unit for Adolf Hitler. Being a soldier fully committed to his position, Himmler steadily rose through the ranks to become Reichsführer SS by 1929. As Reichsführer SS, Himmler received authority directly from Hitler to carry out ideological policies that the laws of the state might not allow. This ideologically rooted Führer authority gave him the power to lock people in prison indefinitely and even commit mass murder without any consequences. The Nazi leaders justified this extra-legal chain of command, as well as the policies initiated under Himmler by the national emergency legislation, as well as the intensified emergency created by the war. During his regime, the SS grew from a 290-man battalion into one of the most powerful and respected institutions within Nazi Germany. From 1943, he was both chief of the criminal police, as well as the Minister of Interior, which gave him oversight of all internal and external police and security forces, including the Gestapo. He was also in charge of the Waffen-SS, a branch of the SS that served in combat alongside the Wehrmacht in World War II. But that's where his influence ended. You see, Himmler was the head of the concentration camp where those captured were being brutally humiliated, tortured, and maltreated. One of the core components of the concentration camp system, which became the daily routine of prisoners, was hard labor. However, this system was largely determined by external political and economic factors that drove demand for labor. During the first few years of the camps, unemployment was high, and prisoners were forced to perform economically valueless but strenuous tasks. This includes farming on moorland in Esterwagen, while other prisoners had to work on the construction work going on in the camps. Himmler was one of those who first proposed the idea of creating camp brothels. He believed that this would help prevent riots and escapes, while giving the prisoners something to look forward to. But that's not all. You see, Himmler also believed that the brothels could serve as a cure for homosexuality. Because of this, Himmler would direct all gay prisoners to make compulsory visits to the brothel once per week. Apparently, he believed that by forcing them into intimacy with women, he could kill the same-sex attraction. But obviously this didn't work. However, while the experience at the camp brothels was generally horrible, Nazi soldiers were especially cruel to the Jewish women in the Holocaust. From the very genesis of his regime, Adolf Hitler made one thing very clear. He harbored a strong dislike for Jews and was willing to wipe them off the face of the earth. During its time, the Nazi regime targeted all Jews, both men, women, and children. So when the brothel system was proposed, best believe Jewish women were the main target. Out of the 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust, 2 million were women. Between 1941 and 1945, the Jewish women were imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. Although some hid themselves in order to avoid being captured by the Nazis under Hitler's regime in Germany, most of them were eventually caught. Locked away in the death camps, these women were sexually harassed, forced into prostitution, beaten, and even used as lab rats for Nazi human experiments. Upon entering the concentration camps, these women were immediately dehumanized. Their bodies were tattooed for identification. Every single hair on their bodies was immediately shaved, and their body cavities were invaded and violated publicly, all part of a systematic process of degradation and humiliation. That's not where it ends, though. Because of the kind of conditions they were forced to live in, many of these women suffered severe damage to their reproductive systems. In some cases, Jewish prisoners developed amenorrhea due to the disruption of their menstrual cycle, reducing their chances of having their own children. Then there was the issue of forced intercourse, which was one of the major risks faced by women in the Holocaust. These women, both within and outside the brothels, were sometimes forced against their will. Then they were murdered. It was reported that 50 to 80% of the SS troops and police units that operated in Eastern Europe were guilty of the assault on Jewish women, not only for pleasure, but also to exert dominance and dehumanize them. This was in spite of the Nazi law that forbids sexual relations between ethnic Germans and Jews, which was punishable by jail or death. There were also instances of SS unit parties where defenseless Jewish women were sexually assaulted until they fell to the ground bleeding. Some historians conclude that because SS officers and soldiers were male, Jewish boys and men faced less risk of sexual assault than the women. In addition, Jewish women were not allowed to get pregnant, and anyone who accidentally conceived was forced to get an abortion. Now, many years later, the horrors faced by the Jewish women remain a part of the legacy built by Nazi Germany. Although this chapter of history is often overlooked, it's impossible to separate the brothel stories from the Second World War and everything else that came along with it. Sadly, most of the stories will never be heard, all buried within the dark walls of Nazi concentration camps. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.